Today I'm going to tell you why you need to balance the microbes in your soil to get the very best vegetables. If you love growing your own vegetables and plants and watching videos about people talking about soil and things like that, maybe you should consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help me. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. That helps me too. Let's get straight into the video. Now, I actually got to this location to film part for this video on my bike. Stay tuned for later on though. We're going to see if I'm going to brain myself or if I survive when I hop this log. Today I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I've actually seen very few other people cover. Certainly there's not a lot else on YouTube. It talks about the principles of this, but not too much about the practicalities and how you can apply this information I'm going to tell you in this video to what you're doing, and that is growing the healthiest, tastiest food that you can yourself. Before I get to that, I'm just going to give you a quick heads up. I'm going to give examples for 3 vegetables. One of those vegetables, which I'll talk about in a bit, you might actually be a little bit surprised about what I say about it, so stay tuned for that. First off, I'm going to explain to you why I'm stood in the middle of this beautiful grassy field. Before I get to the nub of this video and talk about the vegetables that I mentioned earlier, I'm going to provide a little bit of context. Now, this grassy field, it could be a permanent pasture. I actually know a little bit about the history of this. There was a crop growing here previously. The grass has just been allowed to grow quite long. But it could be a permanent pasture, and in which case, if we looked at the life in the soil underneath my feet, we'll probably find lots of bacteria, fungi, protozoa and nematodes that are well established and in some sense of balance. Compare that to other grassy situations such as a Gulf green, and what we see there is an intensive monoculture, so fine turf grass species growing in very high density, very close to a predominantly sandy soil and under a lot of stress. But the important thing to understand here is that whilst the soil characteristics, so the texture, what it's made up of, the sand, silt and clay that I've mentioned in other videos, and things like the pH can influence the biological characteristic, it's the grass itself, so the plant that you are growing, that will provide one of the biggest influencing factors to the type of microorganisms that are the dominant fraction in the soil. And grassy environments, notwithstanding this permanent pasture that I'm in, really do prefer a more bacterial soil. So that Gulf course, that Gulf green analogy I just gave, the grasses growing in it would prefer a more bacterial dominant soil. Whereas this gorgeous woodland that I'm stood in, the soil will predominantly be made up of bacteria, fungi, protozoa and nematodes as well, but the dominating fraction is going to be the fungi, and that is because of all of these lovely trees that we see behind me. They are the dominant plant and they influence the soil to drive up levels of fungi. And we can see how they do this with my fantastic shovel, which you can do yourself in your garden, looking at trees or even just the normal veggies that you grow. I'm at the bottom of a lovely early mature oak tree. I'm no arborist, but I have a general understanding. I do know that this woodland is an ancient woodland, although all the trees aren't necessarily ancient or veteran. The woodland itself has been here for some time, so that means that the soil itself is incredibly well established. It's kind of co-evolved, if you like, with the trees themselves. So I'm going to have a little dig and show you another of the reasons why the soil here is influenced in such a way to lend itself to high fungi levels. So first things first, you can see that there is a lot of debris, detritus, natural organic matter, so bits of twig as well as leaves that have fallen down from the tree. So the tree itself is actually cycling organic matter naturally and providing the perfect complex carbon compounds that organisms like fungi love. So in addition to emitting these exudates from the tree roots into the soil, which also help feed and nurture soil life like fungi, it's also feeding from the top down as well, so as to really promote and drive up the organisms on which it depends. And we can have a little look here. We can actually see there's a lot of feeder roots here, which I talked in a previous video about fine root turnover, things like no dig, which you might be practicing in your vegetable patch. That fine root turnover, so the remains of the previous plants and veggies that you were growing, is super important for helping to naturally build up soil organic matter. So now we're just going to have a light dig down into the soil and see if there's anything much to note. And actually already, here we go, I can see, let's get the camera zoomed in, so I haven't had to go particularly far. You can see these white flecks, which are in fact fungal hyphae. So there's one here, and some hyphal strands on top of this soil particulate as well. So why is this important for you? Well, I'll come to that in a second, but the contrast between the open grassland space outside and this very mature, evolved woodland scenario really highlights the difference between having a more bacterial soil compared to a fungal dominant soil. And this is the very principle which leads us on to what you need to know to grow healthier, better, tastier food in your garden. So first up, I'm going to talk about carrots. Love those little orange conical vegetables, super tasty. You cannot beat how they taste when you grow them yourselves compared to when you buy them and eat them from a supermarket. Now, carrots, whilst they prefer a loose, free draining soil, and often that type of soil with a low ability to retain nutrients, they actually prefer a soil with a higher proportion of bacteria. So a little bit like the grassy examples I've given. The thing is, you're only going to know the balance in terms of organisms in your soil if you test it. And there are so many factors that can actually influence the current state. So the previous crop you've grown being one of the highest influencing factors. So it really is critical that you test your soil. I'll leave a link at the end for a video I've done on how to test your soil for biology. You might find that helpful. Now, you're only going to know what actions are required to manage that ratio. So if you find that you haven't really got a bacterial ratio as you'd want, you're only going to know what amendments to add to your soils if you test it. So if, like most people, you're rotating what you grow, it's my opinion that you're better to aim for a more balanced soil, which means an equal amount of bacteria to fungi, rather than just aiming outright for a bacterious soil that's suited specifically for carrots. Next up is that beast of a veggie called a potato. Probably one of the most consumed vegetables on the planet, mainly because it's made into all sorts of other things such as fries, but a very important mainstay in most people's vegetable gardens, allotments, or in their homestead. Now, potatoes are incredibly intensive and a hungry beast, both nutritionally speaking and biologically. They remove a great deal of nutrients from the soil, and they can therefore stimulate organisms to cycle through organic matter quicker than usual. Also, a wide number of studies exist which show that organism ratios change over time, and so whilst initially it might appear that the vegetable prefers a bacterial dominant soil, over time the pendulum swings back to become more fungal over years. I'll link to one of those studies underneath in the description. Now, if you grow potatoes in the same place every year, this is obviously a bad thing. So again, best thing you can do is to rotate the position of what you are growing in your garden. The intensity of the plant-soil interaction and the organism interaction is such that persistent growing in the same place can have a really negative effect on soil biological health. Over time, those fungi levels could actually increase with continuous cropping from the same place in your garden, and that ultimately could introduce pathogens, especially fungal pathogens, which can be particularly nasty for potatoes. So the third and final veggie that I'm going to talk about is that wonderful superfood, broccoli. But actually it's not all what it seems, and what I'm about to say is perhaps a little bit controversial. So broccoli is a superfood, but it's not necessarily so super for microbes. Whilst broccoli is an amazing food for both the human gut with the organisms that it can transplant straight into the human microbiome, it isn't quite as diverse with its soil interactions as the other two vegetables. Broccoli is a member of the brassica family, and brassicas do not form the same close connections with certain organisms in the soil, namely fungi, that a lot of other vegetables will form. One of these types of fungi is called mycorrhizal fungi, and it's well understood to be impaired in terms of its connection with the plant where brassicas are concerned. I would therefore recommend with broccoli, as with the other two, aim for a well-balanced soil, so an organism ratio that has equal parts bacteria to fungi. Hopefully you have an adequate supply of organisms in your soil to cash in with whatever vegetables, food and plants you're growing. If not, you're probably going to have to do something about that, like introduce an amendment such as compost to add diversity and boost numbers. If you don't know, I strongly recommend that you test your soil and find out. That will help you plan what you need to do and ensure you'll have the most bountiful harvests going forwards. So my big takeaway from this video though is diversity. Whatever you are doing, keep changing it. That means change the plants that you're growing each year, the species or varieties that you're growing, change the locations that they're growing in. It's kind of just the same as this woodland that I'm stood in. You'll see that there's different species of tree growing all over the place. All of that adds a rich, diverse microbial basis which underpins the whole woodland. You can do the same. You need to think in a similar vein when planning what you're growing and changing it as frequently as you are able. There we go everyone, that wraps this video up. I hope you found it useful. If you liked it, do give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. I would love to hear from you all, so if you've got any thoughts or suggestions or burning questions that you need answering, either drop them in the comments or send me an email in the description below. I read and respond to all of those, so I will come back to you. See you in the next video. Yo!